There are some things in life that don't announce themselves before they arrive. They don't knock on your door or give you time to prepare. They just show up one morning, quiet as a shadow, and by the time you realize what's happening, the ground has already shifted beneath your feet. My name is Daniel, and I'm 63 years old. I've built houses for 40 years. Not just built them, I've raised them from nothing. I know what it means to dig a foundation in frozen ground, to pour concrete in the rain, to put your hands on a wall and know that it will stand long after you're gone. I thought I knew how to build things that lasted. I thought I knew how to pick what was worth keeping. I was wrong about one very important thing, and it nearly cost me everything. But this isn't a story about what I lost. I want you to understand that right from the beginning, friend. This is a story about what I found when everything else was stripped away. This is the story of a man who was told he was finished and what happened when the people who said it found out they were wrong. It started the way most real disasters start. Not with a bang. With a Tuesday. I was in the middle of a job site review, walking the second floor of a custom home we were framing in Greenfield, Ohio. Good project, good crew, good morning. I remember the smell of fresh-cut pine and cold air. I remember one of my guys, Ricky, laughing at something on the other side of the room. I remember thinking we were ahead of schedule. And then, I remember nothing because my heart stopped. They told me later that Ricky caught me before I hit the floor, that they called 911 in under a minute, that the paramedics got there in 8. And met it. They told me I was technically dead for 43 seconds on that job site before they brought me back. 43 seconds. I've thought about that number more times than I can count. An entire lifetime can pivot on 43 seconds. I woke up 3 days later in the cardiac ICU at Mercy General. The ceiling was white. The light was too bright. There were tubes in my arm and a monitor beside me that beeped with every heartbeat, and I remember being grateful for each one of those beeps in a way I had never been grateful for anything in my life. I had survived a massive cardiac event. They had performed emergency bypass surgery while I was unconscious. My sternum had been cracked open. My chest felt like someone had parked a truck on it. But I was alive. The first face I saw when I came fully awake was my brother Frank. He was sitting in the corner chair with his reading glasses on and his hands folded in his lap, looking like he'd been there for hours. He probably had. Frank is 4 years younger than me and built like a refrigerator, but when he saw me open my eyes, he got up so fast, he knocked the chair back against the wall. He crossed the room in 2 steps and grabbed my hand, and I saw something in my little brother's face that I had never seen before in 60-odd years of knowing him. Fear. Real fear. The kind that doesn't go away with a handshake. "You scared me half to death, Danny," he said, his voice rough. I tried to smile. It hurt. I asked him where Claire was. He got quiet. Now, friends, I need to tell you about Claire before I tell you what happened next. Because you can't understand the thing that came later without understanding what I thought I had. What I believed with my whole heart. Claire and I had been married for 22 years. We met when I was 41 and she was 34. She was a real estate agent at the time, sharp and stylish, with a way of walking into a room that made everyone look up. I was a single man who had spent most of his 30s buried in work, telling himself there'd be time for all of that later. When I met Claire, I thought later had finally arrived. We had a good life. A beautiful home on Sycamore Drive that I built myself. Every cabinet, every hardwood floor, every stone on the fireplace I put there with my own hands. We had 2 cars, a healthy savings account, and a construction company I had spent 30 years growing from a 2-man operation into a firm with 60 employees. I gave her everything I knew how to give. Vacations in Sedona, a kitchen remodel she'd wanted for years, a new car every time the old one started feeling dated to her. I did it because I loved her. I did it because I thought that was what love looked like. But there were signs I chose not to read. Aren't there always? I remember a winter evening about 4 years before the hospital. I'd come home late from a long day on a commercial project in Columbus. I was exhausted, my knees were aching, and I had been looking forward to a quiet dinner with my wife. The house was dark when I got home. Claire was in bed, asleep, at 8:30 in the evening. And Claire. There was nothing on the stove, nothing in the fridge that resembled dinner. I ate crackers and peanut butter standing over the kitchen sink and told myself she must have had a hard day too. I never mentioned it. I remember the company Christmas party 2 years before the heart attack. I had introduced Claire to a group of my project managers. Men I'd worked alongside for over a decade, people who respected me, and she had smiled politely and then spent the entire evening on the other side of the room, talking to the wives of the newer associates. On the drive home, she said, and I can still hear the exact tone of her voice, "Your work friends are so blue-collar." I told myself she was just tired. I was a master at telling myself things. My brother Frank had tried to talk to me once. We were at his place for Thanksgiving maybe 5 years back, and after dinner when the women had moved to the living room, Frank had leaned across the table with a beer in his hand and said, "Danny, does Claire actually like any of this? Any of it, the job sites, your guys, the long hours?" And I'd gotten defensive. I told him he didn't know her, that she showed love differently, that some people aren't naturally warm, but it doesn't mean they don't care. Frank had looked at me for a long moment and then nodded slowly. He didn't push it, but he remembered. He always remembered. So when I woke up in that hospital room with a cracked sternum and a second chance at life, and I asked my brother where my wife was and he went quiet, I already knew, somewhere deep in the part of myself I had been silencing for years, that the quiet meant something bad. "She was here yesterday," Frank said carefully. "She went home last night. Said she needed to sleep in her own bed." I had been in a coma for 3 days. I had flatlined on a job site and had my chest surgically opened, and my wife had gone home to sleep in her own bed. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation, that she was overwhelmed, that grief makes people act strange. I sent a text from Frank's phone since mine was God knows where. "Hey, I'm awake. It's, I love you." No reply came in the first hour, or the second. Frank sat with me all day. He brought me terrible hospital coffee and talked about nothing in particular, steering us away from the subject we were both thinking about. Around dinner time, he stepped out to take a phone call. He was gone for a long time. When he came back in, he sat down. He didn't say anything right away. He just put his big hands on his knees and stared at the floor. "Frank," I said, "tell me." He looked up, and there were those eyes again. That look. "She went to see a lawyer, Danny. Last week, while you were under." He paused. "She's filed for divorce." I want to tell you exactly what that moment felt like, because I think some of you listening to me right now have felt a version of it, and you deserve to know you're not alone in it. It felt like the bypass surgery all over again, not physical, but the same sensation of something essential being cracked open. The room didn't spin. Everything became very still. The beeping of the monitor seemed to come from somewhere far away. I stared at the ceiling tile directly above my bed, and I counted the little holes in it the way you count things when your brain is trying to protect itself from what it just heard. 62 holes in one tile. Frank was talking. I could hear him, but not quite understand him. He was saying something about the lawyer, about papers, about Claire saying she'd wanted out for years. I came back into the room slowly, like surfacing from deep water. And just as Frank finished speaking, the door opened. She was dressed well. That's the detail I keep coming back to. I was lying in a hospital bed with surgical drains still in my chest, and Claire walked in wearing a cream-colored blazer and slacks, her hair done, her lipstick on. She had a leather portfolio under her arm. She looked, God help me, like she was going to a listing appointment. She didn't come to the bed. She stood near the door and looked at me across the room with an expression I didn't recognize. Not grief, not guilt, assessment. And, like she was calculating the distance between where she was standing and where she needed to get to. "I'm glad you're awake," she said. "I wanted to do this in person." She set the portfolio on the bedside table and opened it. Inside was a stack of legal documents, tabbed with little sticky arrows marking the signature lines. She had thought ahead. She had come prepared. "The house goes with me," she said, her voice level. "I've been living in it for 22 years. And my name is on the deed. The car is mine. I'm entitled to half the business assets. My attorney has already reviewed the valuation." She paused. "I'm not trying to make this ugly, Daniel. I just want what's fair." I looked at her. I thought about all the crackers and peanut butter dinners. All the dark, quiet houses I came home to, all the times I had chosen to look the other way, and I thought about 43 seconds on a cold floor in Greenfield, Ohio, and the fact that she had not once asked me how I felt. "Claire," I said. My voice was hoarse from the ventilator tube they'd pulled 2 days earlier. "I almost died." She nodded slowly, assent, almost gently. "I know, and I'm sorry about that. But Daniel, the truth is, this has been over for a long time. You were always at that job site, always with those crews, always tired. You were never really here." She picked up the portfolio and held the papers out toward me. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. You can't take care of yourself right now. The least I can do is make this process simple." Then she said it. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being a nurse to someone who has nothing left to offer." Nothing left to offer. Friends, I have swung a hammer in -10-degree weather. I have poured foundations in August heat. I have buried my mother and my father and kept showing up to work the next morning because that's what men in my family do. But I want you to know that those 7 words, from the woman I had built a home for with my own 2 hands, those words hit me somewhere nothing else ever had. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I said, "Leave the papers. I'll have my lawyer review them." I think something flickered across her face. I think she expected tears. Maybe begging. She had prepared herself for a scene, and I gave her nothing. She nodded, set the documents on the table, and left. Frank, who had been standing in the corner of the room, so still I had almost forgotten he was there, finally exhaled. "And, Danny," he started. "I know," I said. "You can't just sign those papers." "I know," I said again. And I meant something different than he thought. Here's what Frank didn't know yet. Here's what Claire's very thorough attorney was about to discover. 6 weeks before I collapsed on that job site, I had sat in the office of my attorney, a woman named Patricia Osgood who had handled my business affairs for 15 years. I wasn't planning for divorce. I wasn't suspicious of Claire. I was sitting in that office because I was 62 years old and I had recently watched my business partner of 20 years get a cancer diagnosis. And mortality had come knocking in a way I hadn't been able to ignore. I was thinking about legacy. I was thinking about what happens if something happens to me. I had put the business into a family trust. My brother Frank, the man who had caught the news before I was even fully conscious, the man who had sat beside my hospital bed for 3 days, was named the sole trustee. I had transferred ownership of the Sycamore Drive property into that same trust 18 months prior, for tax planning purposes that Patricia had recommended and I had agreed to. My accounts, my investment portfolio, my ownership stake in 3 commercial properties in Central Ohio, all of it had been restructured. All of it sat inside a legal framework that had nothing to do with my marriage and everything to do with protecting 40 years of work from the kind of chaos that comes when a man disappears without warning. I had done it out of pragmatism, out of a builder's instinct, reinforced the structure before the storm, not during it. End quote. End quote. And now, lying in a hospital bed with a healing sternum and a very clear head, I understood that what I had done out of practicality had quietly become the most important decision of my life. I said nothing. I played the part that Claire had already written for me. I was the broken down man, the one with nothing left to offer. I let my lawyer, Patricia, handle the paperwork at a pace that Claire's attorney found frustratingly slow. I recovered. I went through cardiac rehab 3 mornings a week, and on the days I didn't have rehab, Frank drove me to a rented apartment on the east side of town, a plain, clean place with 2 bedrooms and a view of a parking garage, and we sat at the kitchen table and we worked. We worked the way I had always worked, quietly, steadily, without announcing what we were building. The final divorce hearing was on a gray morning in March. I walked in on my own 2 feet. I had a cane that I didn't strictly need anymore, but it served a purpose. Claire arrived with her attorney, a man named Garrett who had the smooth, certain manner of someone who had never once been surprised in a courtroom. He wore a very good suit and he carried a very fat briefcase, and he shook hands with Patricia like a man who already knew the outcome. Claire sat beside him at the table. She was dressed impeccably, as always. She had the posture of someone about to collect something they'd earned. Patricia set her files on the table without drama. She was a small woman with gray-streaked hair and reading glasses on a chain, and she had a gift for making the most devastating information sound like a weather report. Garrett began. He presented Claire's claims in the confident, unhurried voice of a man, reading from a script he'd rehearsed until it was smooth. The Sycamore Drive property, the business valuation, the investment accounts, the commercial properties. He laid it all out, with the systematic pleasure of someone dividing a pie they expected to enjoy. When he was finished, Patricia thanked him. Then she opened her folder. The property at Sycamore Drive, she said, was transferred into the Daniel Marsh Family Trust approximately 18 months ago. The trust is administered by the sole trustee, Mr. Frank Marsh. Mr. Daniel Marsh holds no direct title to the property. She turned a page. The business assets of Marsh Construction and Development are held in the same trust, effective 3 years ago, as part of an estate planning restructure. Mr. Daniel Marsh draws a salary as an operating employee. He holds no ownership stake that falls under marital property statutes. The room was very quiet. Garrett looked at his documents. He looked at Patricia's documents. He looked at them again. I watched his jaw tighten. The investment accounts, he started. Also within the trust, Patricia said. I have the transfer documentation dated 14 months prior. 10. Garrett turned to Claire. Something passed between them in that look, the moment when a very confident man realizes that the foundation he built his case on was always hollow. He leaned toward her, his voice low, and I could see Claire's face from across the table as she listened to him. The composure held for about 4 seconds. Then, it cracked. What does that mean? She said. Her voice had risen half an octave. What does it mean he has no ownership stake? He built that company. We were married. That company is as much mine as it is. Mrs. Marsh, the judge said quietly, I live in that house. She was looking at me now, not at her attorney. I have lived in that house for 22 years. You cannot just move an asset into a. Mrs. Marsh. The judge's voice was firmer. Garrett put a hand on her arm. She shook it off. When did you do this? She was pointing at me, not trembling, rigid, like something that was about to snap. When did you plan this? Because you planned it. This is not an accident. You knew. You knew what you were doing. I looked at her from across that table. I thought about the Christmas party. I thought about the crackers over the sink. I thought about 43 seconds and how I'd spent them. I said nothing. The proceedings were suspended for 20 minutes. When they resumed, Garrett had run the numbers and confirmed what Patricia had laid out methodically and without a hint of satisfaction. What Claire had expected to leave with, by law, did not exist in the form she had assumed. She had hurried this process. 10. She had pushed to finalize everything before I had found my footing, and in doing so, she had signed documents that committed her to a division of assets that left her with exactly what she had brought into the marriage. I drove home with Frank. We didn't say much. The March sky was still gray, and the fields alongside the highway were the color of old hay, and I watched Ohio roll by through the passenger window and felt something in my chest that had nothing to do with the bypass surgery. It was a loosening, like a knot that had been pulled tight for years and had finally been allowed to release. 3 weeks later, there was a knock at my apartment door on a Sunday afternoon. Frank was there with me. He answered it. And there was Claire. She wasn't wearing the blazer. She was in jeans and a coat I recognized as one she'd had for years, before the good years, and her hair wasn't done the way it always was. She looked smaller, somehow. She looked like the version of a person that appears when the performance is finally too exhausting to maintain. She asked if she could come in. I told Frank it was all right. He stayed in the kitchen. I sat in the living room and let her stand in the middle of it because I wasn't going to ask her to sit down. She tried several things. She tried reasonableness. She said she'd been rash, that she'd acted out of fear. She tried tenderness. She said she remembered who we used to be, that there had been real love between us, and she wasn't wrong about that. She tried guilt. She mentioned 22 years, mentioned the home we'd shared, mentioned that she had nowhere to go. I let her try each one and said nothing, and after a while, the silence seemed to take something out of her. I didn't mean what I said, she finally said. In the hospital, about you having nothing to offer. Ah, I know you meant it. I said, not with anger, just with the particular piece of a man who has had enough time to look at something clearly and accept what he sees. I think you've meant it for a while. I think I knew that and kept choosing not to. She looked at me. Something went through her eyes that might have been genuine grief, or its cousin. I built you a house, I said, with my own hands. Every room in it. I woke up every morning for 22 years, and I gave you everything I knew how to give. And when the moment came when I needed someone to sit beside me, you went home to sleep in your own bed. I paused. I think we both know what that means. However, she started to say something. I shook my head. You told me I had nothing left to offer. But the truth is, what I have to offer never changed. You just stopped wanting it. And that's not my failure, Claire. That's the answer to a question I should have asked a long time ago. She left without another word. Frank walked her out and I sat in that quiet apartment, and I want to be honest with you, friends, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, the way you feel after a long job is finally done. But underneath the tiredness, something else, something clean, something that felt, if I'm being accurate, like freedom. That was 14 months ago. I walk 3 miles every morning now. My cardiologist says my numbers are better than they were at 50. I went back to Marsh Construction 6 months after the surgery, not as the guy who swings the hammer. Those days are behind me, but as the man who looks at a set of plans and knows what's possible and what's not. My guys threw a party when I came back. Ricky, the one who caught me when I fell, stood up and gave a toast that made half the room need to look at the ceiling for a minute. I am not ashamed to say I was one of them. Frank is still the trustee. He'll be the trustee until we decide otherwise. He has the coffee ready every Monday morning when I come in, and he has a way of looking at me across the conference table that says everything that neither of us needs to put into words. I hear Claire is in Columbus now. I don't know the details and I don't ask. Here's what I want to say to you, whoever you are that's still with me at the end of this. I'm not telling you this story so you can feel good about someone else's misfortune. I'm not telling it to you because I think I handled everything perfectly. I didn't, not by a long shot. And the 22 years I spent building a marriage on sand were 22 years I could have spent differently. I'm telling you this story because someone listening to me right now is in a hospital bed or beside one, or lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering whether the person sleeping next to them sees them or just sees what they provide. And I want that person to hear this. You are not the sum of what you can give. You are not the truck you drive or the house you own or the salary you deposit. You are not defined by the worst morning of your life or the cruelest thing someone said to you in a room that smelled like antiseptic. Pay attention to who shows up, not who says the right things in public, not who looks good standing next to you in photographs, who actually shows up when the monitor is beeping and the room is too bright and you need someone to hold your hand in the dark. That person is the architecture of your real life. Everything else is decoration. I was told I had nothing left to offer. And I want you to know that I built 3 new homes last year, and I walked every one of those job sites on my own 2 feet, and I have coffee on Monday mornings with my brother, and I sleep better than I have in a decade. The man with nothing left to offer is doing just fine. The man with nothing left to offer is still building, and he will keep building, friend, because that is the only thing he has ever known how to do, and it turns out that was always enough.